Hi everybody and welcome back. We're very quickly moving throughout the semester and here we are finding ourselves in week 6 exploring the topic of social disorganization theory. This topic is probably one of the most visible and the most concrete types of theories that we have available. Sure, it's easy to try and imagine the concept of learning or the concept of attachment, but social disorganization is a theory in action, and we see this theory taking place in every city and town across the country, even right here in our own backyard. What's also important to note is that social disorganization focuses on things at the macro level rather than at the micro level. If we're looking at neighborhoods and environments, then we're looking at things at the group level rather than within the individual. How can we explain crime based on behavioral patterns of the group? As Akers, Sellers, and Jennings mention in their text, social disorganization is a structural theory. If everyone in the community is exposed to the same types of conditions, how do those environmental factors influence individual behaviors? Social disorganization is largely rooted within the Chicago School and the initial efforts of Sean McKay to figure out the root reasons why an environment played such a large role in behavior. The theory works to connect different crime rates to neighborhood characteristics. One of the main principles of social disorganization theory is that place matters. In other words, a person's residential location is a substantial factor in shaping the likelihood that the person will become involved in illegal activities. This theory suggests that while individual characteristics like age, gender, and race are still vitally important predictor variables, residential location is just as important as these individual level characteristics. When talking about things like juvenile delinquency, low-income neighborhoods almost promote participation in delinquent subcultures as they have been inherently present there for generations. Sean McKay noted that neighborhoods with the highest crime rates have at least 3 common problems. The first is physical dilapidation of the actual structures. 2 is poverty, and finally, higher levels of ethnic and cultural mixing. Sean McKay claimed that delinquency was not caused at the individual level, but is actually a normal response by normal individuals to the abnormal conditions that they find themselves living in. They relied on mapping in order to pinpoint areas in which delinquency was highest, and they then created zones in which they could describe and normalize behavior within those living spaces. These were largely influenced by Burgess's concentric zone theory. These zones reached out from city center, and each zone considered crime in relation to behavior and neighborhood characteristics. Closest to city center was what they called the Central Business Zone or Central Business District in Zone 1. This is where you're going to find most businesses, some department stores, your skyscrapers, your loading docks, your factories. But at the time, there was some, very minimal, but some residential areas to be found. Zone 2, or the zone in transition, is where you saw a lot of low-income housing. Really, for the time period, what we're talking about is tenement housing or buildings that should have been condemned but were rented out as very low income living space. And because we're talking about early 1900s research here, Zone 2 is largely comprised of immigrants and the poor. If we're talking about big cities like Chicago, where this particular type of research was conducted, we're talking about neighborhoods that are largely comprised by European immigrants, and they're settling in neighborhoods based on their ethnic groupings. So if you've ever been to a large city like New York or Chicago or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, what you have are ethnic neighborhoods. All the Italians live here, all of the Poles live here, the Germans live over here, and even when they die, they are buried in specific cemeteries in which they are divided up based on ethnic and religious background. So the Italian Catholics are in this cemetery, the German Protestants are over here, and really there's a big segregation, self-imposed segregation that's taking place within these cities because that's what the immigrants are used to. right? And what you're seeing are a big group of European immigrants that have just come over. They're fresh off the boat and they're freshly settled, so they don't have a whole lot of money after making that very grueling trip trying to immigrate over to the United States. So where they're able to afford to live is in these really, really bad living conditions. And still, you might find just the fringes of the business district sort of imposing on Zone 2, but what you're not finding here are the established wealthy and middle classes. They're living elsewhere. In Zone 3, you're starting to see the beginnings of outward mobility. Those individuals who live in Zone 3 have been able to get out of the inner cities and they live in slightly better conditions, but still we're not talking about mansions here. We're still not talking about the best of conditions. Zones 4 and 5 are where you get to the residential and commuter zones, and that's where you're seeing the ability of the workers to commute into the city to work. But that takes money. So these are the zones in which you see the wealthy and the middle classes living. They're individuals who have bought their homes, they commute to work, they're living in single family homes, so no longer apartment style living for the most part, maybe townhomes or something like that, but for the most part it's one family living in this individual structure. And these two zones are essentially comprising what we call the initial suburbs, right? You don't have to live in the dirty and polluted inner city that you work in all day long and all night long. At the end of your workday, you get to go home to something that's clean and something that smells good and something that's safe to live in because you can afford to do so. And in these areas, the further you get out, you can imagine what's going to happen in terms of the crime rate. So Sean McKay spent years examining the patterns that they found in these different zones. And they realized that everybody is trying so desperately hard to get out from the city and are trying to get into zones 4 and 5. Not only are they cleaner and a more welcoming place to reside, but these are the areas that are safer with much lower crime rates, especially compared to Zone 2, which is the zone of transition. And that is by far the worst place to be. This zone is where crime rates are the highest, and these neighborhoods are strongly characterized by decaying buildings and properties. Some of these properties even need to be abandoned. They're not fit for human beings to live in. Family structures are broken. We often see high rates of infant mortality for the area because access to healthcare is limited. Incomes are consistently lower compared to those incomes for persons who are living in zones 4 and 5, and it's difficult to improve one's station in life because job opportunities often consist of menial labor. With all of these different conditions at play, it's no wonder there's a high level of crime taking place in addition to drug and alcohol use, rampant prostitution, and other types of vice behaviors. As you move further away from city center, you see these problem behaviors decreasing in frequency. Based on their mapping, Sean McKay have discovered that there were 4 specific assumptions that are being made as an explanation for delinquency. The first assumption is that the collapse of community-based controls are occurring and that people living in these disadvantaged neighborhoods are responding naturally to environmental conditions. Right? So when all of the controls around you are collapsing, nobody seems to care about their neighbors, the buildings are in disarray, the buildings might be falling apart, you just got evicted because you can't afford the rent. When all of these things are happening, it's human nature to respond to the stimuli that's going on around you, and that response might result in crime. The second is the rapid growth of immigration in urban disadvantaged neighborhoods. So what you're seeing here is what we talked about before. In the early 1900s and even in the late 1800s, we're seeing a large influx of namely European immigrants that are coming into an already populated living space. There is very limited room for all of these new people, so everybody is packing into these old, rundown, dilapidated buildings, and sometimes you have 2 or 3 families living in a space that is only meant for one family. So it's very difficult to have clean, orderly living conditions when you have that many people sort of parked or camped in there like sardines in a space that is not meant for that many individuals. The third assumption is that businesses that are located closely to the disadvantaged neighborhoods are influenced by the ecological approach of competition and dominance. So when you have all of these things happening in this small amount of space, you have everybody vying for the same amount of jobs. What businesses are able to do is lower wages on these immigrant workers. They're able to lower the cost of production because they're not paying their workers as much, and they're really increasing their profits and their ability to stay competitive within the market based on where the location is and their worker structure. And then finally, the fourth and last assumption is that disadvantaged urban neighborhoods lead to the development of criminal values that replace normal society values. And if you think about this, it really makes sense, because if you have very limited income coming in from these jobs that are paying people peanuts, you're all packed like sardines in what has to be the most rank living conditions you could probably imagine. And all of these things are happening around you like we talked about before. Your response to all of this neighborhood level stimuli might be to engage in criminal behaviors. It's no longer just about making it in the United States. It's now about surviving in the United States to later make it later on. So really what this is talking about is just the natural reaction of human beings to in responding to the negative stimuli that they find themselves in, and it becomes a breeding ground for criminal behaviors because people are now susceptible for engaging in this type of deviance. So for a long while, what we saw was Sean McKay's work. It was being considered by academics one of the best theoretical models for explaining crime and deviance at the neighborhood level. Everything else we sort of have seen was explaining crime at the micro level, and now we have something coming along that tries to explain it at more of a macro level. So Sampson and Groves come along in 1989, and they offer a competing model of social disorganization that is considered to be more contemporary in explaining behavior at the group level. However, it was Sampson in his individual work who really took the concept of social disorganization in a new direction. And Sampson's concept of collective efficacy is really reflected in two subscales within his work. The first is being social cohesion among neighbors, combined with their willingness to intervene on behalf of the common good. And then the second is the process of activating or converting social ties among neighborhood residents in order to achieve collective goals, such as the public order or the control of crime. And both of those two items I have directly quoted from Sampson's original work. So what these two items suggest is, even though there might be physical decay within the actual environment or within the neighborhood, it's more about the people living in the neighborhood than the physical structures. And if the people who are living in the neighborhood are still willing to look out for one another and are still willing to make sure that the neighborhood is well taken care of, what this is preventing is behavioral decay. Right? We can't necessarily keep all the buildings intact because we don't have the money to do so, or because the city doesn't provide us with enough resources to be able to keep up with everything that's going on. But at the individual level, we can make sure that behavioral decay is not creeping in. So let's say the neighbors see something happening, right? Someone is breaking in. If those individuals are willing to talk to the police, or if they're willing to informally police the neighbors themselves in some capacity, then social disorganization can be delayed in some way. Another example, let's say you know your next door neighbors, you know that it's a family with teenage children. If you happen to see your neighbor's child skipping school, how likely are you to report that behavior to their parents? By reporting that behavior to the child's parents, then potentially you can create an environment, or you can create enforcement rather, and make sure that the parents know what's happening behind their backs, that their child is not going to school the way they're supposed to. And Sampson really claims that it is a role of the neighbors taking a step and helping the police to informally police other neighbors is just a really vital part of delaying social disorganization, especially for juveniles in the neighborhood, as many violent criminals once belonged to teenage peer groups. Particularly, we're talking about street gangs here, and that a gang member often will become a full-time criminal if social controls are insufficient to address the delinquent behavior that's taking place during their adolescence. Sampson further elaborates in stating that when there is informal supervision or incomplete socialization from the parents, that children from broken families are just way more likely to join violent gangs unless others step in to take the parent's place. So if we're talking about a child that comes from a single parent home, right, and that single parent is constantly working and isn't around to help police the child's behaviors, what the parent needs to do is start relying on other informal networks. Are the grandparents able to step in? Are the next door neighbors able to step in? Are there aunts and uncles somewhere available that are able to step in and help corral these children, even though mom or dad is working all the time, right? However, if there's no dynamic present at all and the child is just raised in a chronically unstable family structure, then these individuals are less likely to be influenced by peer, or likely to be influenced rather from peer groups in a community when no family unit is intact. Tight-knit communities are more likely to identify strangers. They're more likely to report deviance to childhood deviance, adolescence deviance to the parents, and they're more willing to pass warnings along. High rates of residential mobility, meaning there's a lot of turnover in the neighborhood, people are constantly moving in and out, and high-rise housing disrupts the ability to establish and maintain social ties. So if I live in a neighborhood where we have front porches and people sit out on the front stoop at night, I'm more willing to get to know and talk to my neighbors than individuals who live in high-rise apartment buildings. Formal organizations like schools, churches, and the police all can act as surrogate family members in a lot of different communities, but areas in which there are poor and unstable units often are lacking the type of organization and the political connections that are necessary in order to get the same type of resources they need to start fighting crime and limiting delinquency and offering young adolescents alternatives after school compared to just pure deviant behavior. These kids need supervision, but we also need resources to be able to offer that type of supervision. Okay, one of the last things that I want to talk about today is the idea, or not really the idea, but this one book, and you've already talked about it, you've read a little bit about it during Social Learning Week, but I want to read you a little bit of Elijah Anderson's work that comes from the really groundbreaking book, Code of the Street. And I feel like not only does this fit in with social learning theory, but this fits in really well with social disorganization theory as well. If you haven't already read the whole book, I haven't assigned it to you, but I really encourage you to read it. It's something that I first read in graduate school, and I think it's one of the best descriptions and discussions of what life in the inner city is really like. And I wanted to read just a little bit to you because Anderson himself, I mean, he puts it best, right? I could talk about it, but the way that he describes it really is just the most strongest way in which we can possibly visualize it, right? So I want to read just a short excerpt from that book. And Anderson describes the inner city crime and violence problems as follows, and I quote, "Of all the problems besetting the poor inner city black community, none is more pressing than that of interpersonal violence and aggression. It wreaks havoc daily with the lives of community residents and increasingly spills over into downtown and residential middle-class areas. Muggings, burglaries, carjackings, and drug-related shootings, all of which may leave their victims or innocent bystanders dead, are now common enough to concern all urban and many suburban residents. The inclination to violence springs from the circumstances of life among the ghetto poor, the lack of jobs that pay a living wage, the stigma of race, the fallout from rampant drug use and drug trafficking, and the resulting alienation and the lack of hope for the future. He continues by saying, simply living in an environment places young people at special risk for falling victim to aggressive behavior. Although there are often forces in the community which can counteract the negative influences, by far the most powerful being a strong, loving, quote, decent, as inner city residents put it, family committed to middle class values. The despair is pervasive enough to have spawned an oppositional culture, that of the streets, whose norms are often consciously opposed to those of mainstream society. These two orientations, decent and street, socially organize the community, and their coexistence has important consequences for residents, particularly for children growing up in the inner city. Above all, this environment means that even youngsters whose home lives reflect Main Street values, and the majority of homes in the communities do, must be able to handle themselves in a street-oriented environment. This is because the street culture has evolved into what may be called a code of the streets, which amounts to a set of informal rules governing interpersonal public behavior, including violence. The rules prescribed both a proper comportment and a proper way to respond if challenged. They regulate the use of violence and so allow those who are inclined to aggression to participate violent encounters in an approved way. The rules have been established and are enforced mainly by the street-oriented, but on the streets, the distinction between street and decent is often irrelevant. Everybody knows if the rules are violated, there are penalties. Knowledge of the code is thus largely defensive. It is literally necessary for operating in public. Therefore, even though families with a decency orientation are usually opposed to the values of the code, they often reluctantly encourage their children's familiarity with it in order to enable them to negotiate the inner city environment. End quote. Anderson goes on to further discuss the differences between street and decent families and goes into just the most wonderful detail about all of these issues that are occurring in Philadelphian neighborhoods. That's where he completed this research. But one of the main concepts that he focuses on is the idea of manhood and masculinity within the street environment. In order for one to be respected within the neighborhood, one has to be seen as a man. This means engaging in violence and crime, confronting others when he is disrespected, and asserting control and dominance over others. Not only is this important in establishing your place in the pecking order, it's important to survival in this type of environment. Anderson describes many events in which young black men from the decent families have resorted to violence because they are being messed with or because they are being seen as weak and vulnerable. In order to not be victimized, they become the aggressor in order to stay safe. But this is the earmark of socially disorganized neighborhoods in general. There is a need to assert dominance in an area that has been left behind by the rest of society. Limited resources and funding that go into low-income, high-crime areas, and many are distrustful of others. Low income is one of the most predictive factors when it comes to crime rates for these areas. And that is going to be our topic for next week. When economic strains are present, how do individuals still achieve their value goals? Sometimes it's through criminal means. Next week, what we're going to do is turn our attention to enemy and strain theories and see how these economic impacts are affecting our behaviors. Meet me back here next week when we turn our attention to Merton, Agnew, and the other string theorists. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next week. Thank you, and as always, if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thanks. See you guys later. Bye.